In this module, I will discuss how you can manage sources using the NETVIBES library app. So I'm going to start just by looking in our Eastern quadrant, and there are actually a couple of apps that you can use to manage sources in NETVIBES. The first is the feed reader, the second is the library. And the feed reader is a pretty rudimentary app. It's something that's available with the base platform role. So it's available to anyone using the platform. And it's great for being able to monitor a few different individual sources. You can add a feed reader, populate it with one source, and maybe have 4 or 5 different feed readers each looking at one source. The library is an app that allows you to define multiple sources within the same app and then filter the content of those apps. It's only available with the NETVIBES roles. And so if you do have a NETVIBES role, I strongly recommend focusing on using the library app rather than the feed reader. So I'm going to add 3 library apps to my dashboard and start to populate those with some content. And what we're going to be doing with this dashboard is building a dashboard that allows us to monitor information about smart speakers. So some of the sources that we'll be looking at will be kind of focused on that type of content. So first, you'll see we can configure the library with the configure icon in the center. And then using the add content drop-down, there are a few different ways of adding content, each representing a slightly different type of content that you can add to the library. And I'll start with the feed option. So this is RSS feeds, really the primary method that NETVIBES uses to bring in content. And there are a few different ways that you might be able to find them on the source site. So the first method is that we can potentially just auto-detect the RSS feed URL from the main website URL. So if I type in theverge.com, so I can monitor what they're publishing generally, you'll see that we've been able to auto-detect 2 different feeds from that site. If you want to understand what the difference is between the 2, you can click on the preview icon and see what has been published lately, and maybe one or both of those make sense. In this case, it looks like they're just the same feed. So we could click on the one that we want, click on add to my library, and that's really the simplest way of adding a site to your library. However, it's not always that easy, and in some cases it will actually be of benefit to go to the site to see what feeds they have rather than just adding or using the auto-detect feature like I just did. The benefit to it is ease of use. The downside is that there may potentially be other RSS feeds that the site has that just aren't embedded on that main front page. So what I'm going to do now is go to a site and see why you might actually want to go to the site directly to see the feeds that it provides. So I'm going to go to SFGate. And you'll see, if you're familiar with the RSS icon, you'll see up here, and this is the standard icon used to denote RSS feeds, that there is a link there that we can click on to see what kind of RSS feeds they have. And in this case, there are actually RSS feeds for all of the different sections within SFGate. So this allows us to be a bit more focused. If that main site RSS feed was just the most popular articles, it might not capture everything, whereas we can take the URLs that are most relevant to us. So because we're looking at smart speakers, we might want to choose maybe a few different subsections. So maybe we want to take business and technology news, so we'll click on that. This is typically what an RSS feed is going to look like when it's rendered in your browser. So we'll take that URL, go back to our library, click on add content, click on feed, and then just paste in that RSS feed URL, and then select it and add it to the library. And we could potentially take several different sections if we find some that are relevant. And then the final method I'll show is if a site you go to add, maybe we're just not able to auto-detect the RSS feeds and you need to go to the site, and maybe there's actually, maybe it's possible to find the RSS feed even though we weren't able to auto-detect it. So if I go to engadget.com and then scroll down to the bottom this time, we'll see that there is actually an RSS feed link, but this just links to the single RSS feed. So in this case, we'll just copy that URL. You can see it's an RSS feed, and then again, add content, feed, paste in the URL, and then select that feed to add. So those are some of the common ways. Potentially you can get even more in depth and start viewing the source of the web page to see if you can find a RSS link in there somehow, which is an option for the more advanced users. But those are really the most common options for adding RSS feeds. So I will click on Next, give my library a name. We'll call that my sources, and then click on Finish to save it. So in the next library, I'll configure that one using a slightly different type of content. So again, from the Add Content menu, I can click on Topic Search this time. And here, rather than adding sources individually, we're going to define some phrases to search for and then use some different aggregators to pull in any type of content that matches those particular words or phrases that I've input. And this is potentially complementary to adding individual sources. Sometimes it's better to use one or the other, but a lot of the time we use both. And really the advantage to using this method is it's easy because you don't need to know the sources that the relevant content could be published in. You just need to know the subject. And it also allows you to go much more broad and really capture everything. The kind of negative points to using the topic search is the results aren't necessarily going to be as high quality. If you're defining each source individually, you know that they're reputable. Whereas with topic search, you're kind of pulling in all sorts of different content. There is some ability to keep the content high quality, but that is just something to bear in mind. And depending on your use case, one or the other or both may make sense. So in this case, we want to search for content about smart speakers. So what I'll do first is just do a basic search, and then I'll show you some kind of more advanced usage afterwards. So a basic method would be to type in your search terms. So I'll type in smart speaker, the kind of standard way someone would refer to a smart speaker, using 2 words. And I've put those in double quotes just to make sure that the 2 words will be adjacent to each other in the text of any result that would come back, just for relevancy. Next, you can choose a language if you want. I tend to leave it as any language just to get as many results back as possible. And then if you click on the plus, we'll get a list of the different aggregators that we can use. So I'll just give you a rundown of what these are. So first of all, there are several news search aggregators, Bing News, Google News. One note about Google News is they go a bit broader than just news, and they tend to bring in content from blogs as well, which can be useful. Board Reader is really focused on forums and message board type content. Does also bring in content from a few other sites that are maybe outside of where you would typically think that content to be. So one example is Reddit. Next we have image search, which searches Flickr, social search, which searches Twitter, and video search, which searches both YouTube and Dailymotion. The only other thing really to note about these is for Twitter, you will need to log in with a Twitter account. Twitter just requires that those requests are authenticated with a valid Twitter account. So the first time you do this, you will need to just link a valid Twitter account to your dashboard. And you can select as many of these as you like. I will, in this case, just select everything. But if you wanted to just select individual items, you can do so just by clicking on them. So I'll add this to my library, and I'll now have searches for smart speaker across all of the aggregators. So I'm just going to do this once more just to show you how we might want to do it slightly differently. We've done our kind of basic smart speaker search, but you really have to think about the type of language that people might be using when they're referring to this particular topic that you're interested in. They're not always going to use the same language that is what first comes to mind. So an example might be that people may just refer to smart speaker as one word. And there may be other ways as well that people could refer to smart speaker. So we can actually separate different terms or phrases with commas. So I'll search for smart speaker, but then maybe I'll want to search for a few of the more common actual devices. So maybe we'll search for Google Home in quotes. Maybe we'll search for Amazon Echo, again in quotes. And then in the case of Apple HomePod, I actually don't need to qualify HomePod with the word Apple, because I know that HomePod will only bring me, or I think that HomePod will only bring me results for the Apple HomePod. So we'll go for just HomePod in that case. You'll see that my queries here are pretty basic. I'm really just putting in either single words or quoted multi-word phrases. I'm not trying to qualify my words with additional words and phrases. I'm not trying to exclude things. I'm not using any Boolean operators. At this point in the process, when we're in our libraries doing a topic search, you really want to just keep your searches simple like this. It doesn't matter if some of the results that come back aren't relevant. We'll filter those out later when we're actually creating our tracked topics and analytics. So for now, just keep your phrases simple and no Boolean syntax. So again, we'll click the plus. This time we have our 4 different phrases that we're searching for. And again, I'll select all of the search providers and click add to my library. So my topic search library is now complete, so I'll call that topic searches. And again, click on finish. And then for my final library, we're going to use the public profile option. So the public profile is a way to bring in content published by an individual Twitter account. So rather than searching across the whole of Twitter like the topic search did, the public profile will just bring in the content published by a specific Twitter account. And in this case, I'll give an example of wanting to do maybe a competitive analysis, looking at content published by a competitor. So in this case, my competitor will be Google. So I'm going to look for the Twitter account made by Google to get the content about the Google Nest, Google Home, and so on. It'll bring in all of the, or it will display all of the different accounts that match that phrase, so I can select the one I want and add that to my library. So the final option in the drop-down is OPML. So OPML is a standard open format for defining multiple sources, originally just RSS feeds, but we've kind of extended it a little bit. And this is a good way to bring in lists of sources either from other platforms, whether it's maybe another 3D experience platform, or from a third-party RSS reader that you were maybe using. If that service provides the ability to export to OPML, then you can import it using this option. And you can also export to OPML from the library as well. So I'll just click on Next and Finish. And I'm just going to go back to this one just to show you some of the ways we can organize the sources. So I've added a number of sources to this library, but if you decided you wanted to move some of them to another library, you can do so. There's a multi-select option, so you can select some of the sources and move them to another library, copy them, maybe just delete them if you decided you didn't want them. There's also the ability to filter the sources, so if you wanted to just look at the Twitter searches, you can click on that and look at those separately. This can be particularly useful if you have hundreds and hundreds of sources in a library, just to see the ones that you're interested in. A little bit about who can edit the library. So if you've created this library on a dashboard that has other owners or other contributors, anyone with one of those two roles can edit the library. So if they have a reader access, they can't edit it, but anyone with a contributor or owner can. So that's just something to note. And this really kind of aids in collaboration, because generally it does help to have multiple people working on these libraries. And if we go to the next screen, you'll see down at the bottom, we have two options in terms of subscribers, so public and private. So if we select private, this means that this library can only be installed on this particular dashboard. It can't be shared to another dashboard. Whereas if we select public, this potentially could be shared out to a different dashboard, and other users could then access this on another dashboard as long as they have access to this particular tenant. So that's a little bit about some of the sharing. So you'll see that I've created three libraries and essentially got three groups of sources. It is really important to group sources and kind of leverage the fact that you don't just have to put everything in one library. First of all, it's a benefit because it just makes it easier to organize the sources if you don't have them all in one place. So it's useful from that perspective. But also, it's possible when you create the track topics and the analytics to focus your search on one or more libraries. So that's something that is available to you to make your results more relevant. So for example, if you have some sources that are very high quality and you have some other sources that are lower quality and very broad, you're trying to capture everything, there are going to be certain scenarios where you might want to focus in just on those high quality sources. So having those in a separate library will allow you to do that. If you have a library that just has scientific research publications, and then you have another library that it has lots of Twitter searches, generally you're probably not going to want that content to end up in the same analytic or in the same track topic app. So as long as you have those in different libraries, then when you create those apps, you'll be able to segment the data. So that's just something to consider when you're building the libraries. Next, a couple of kind of backup options or alternatives when RSS feeds aren't available. So if you do come across a site that doesn't have RSS, there are a few options to consider to be able to still get similar content. So one is to look at the Twitter profile of the account. it's quite common for the Twitter account to post a lot of the content that was being published on the website anyway. It's not always the case, and there potentially is going to be a lot of other content, so definitely go to the Twitter account and have a look at it and make sure it is publishing content that's relevant. But it's quite common that that can be a good alternative if you can't access the site itself. Secondly, there is a third-party service that we typically recommend if there are a number of sites that you want to monitor that don't provide RSS. So if you run into this problem and you're kind of feeling like there are a number of sites you want to bring in, there's a site called Feedity. It is a paid service and it's not affiliated with Dassault System or NetVibes. However, it is something that we've used a number of times in the past and are using currently, so that's something that we can recommend. Then finally, and this is a kind of real last resort because it doesn't actually allow you to analyze the content in NetVibes, but it can still be useful to just at least have those sites available from the dashboard. So if you use the Quicklinks app, this allows you to just add a list of sites like bookmarks, essentially. If you just have a handful of sites, it just keeps them top of mind. You're not going to be able to analyze the content in NetVibes, but you can at least have a list of those links that you can go and check manually, maybe once a week or once a month. So that's another option as well. So I mentioned sharing libraries. So it is possible to share the library that you've created as long as that public option was checked. And you can do so by clicking the menu and then clicking share. And you can either share to another user on the platform. You can just type in their name or login and it will send them a notification. Or you can create a link that you can then share with someone via instant message or something like that. What happens when this user installs the library on another dashboard is that they'll get a read-only version of the library. So it will look exactly the same, but just without the edit option. And it will provide all of the same sources, all of the history of content in the library, and allow them to perform an analysis or create a track topic on a separate dashboard. This is particularly useful because it means you can have one library powering a number of different dashboards. So if you have 10 different dashboards and you have libraries that are going to be useful across all of them, or at least multiple of them, it means that you can define all of your libraries on one dashboard and then share copies of those libraries to the other dashboards. Yet you can still manage those libraries all in the same place. So there's one dashboard that you use to manage the libraries. And if you do then want to go back and make updates, add new sources, remove old ones, maybe update URLs, any change that you make to that original library will propagate out to the other dashboards that library's been shared to. So that's definitely a recommended scenario if you have multiple dashboards to, rather than kind of create libraries in all sorts of different places, use one dashboard to manage the libraries and then share them out to the others. One note is that if you have shared a library and you then go ahead and delete the source one, the content will no longer be available to those other users who are using the shared version. So that's just something to be aware of if you are using the shared feature. And then finally, the duplicate feature can be useful with libraries. This just creates an exact replica. However, in this case, it actually is editable. So if you've created a library with a lot of sources and want to create a maybe similar version, the duplicate feature is useful in that case. And then one final best practice in terms of organization. Typically, these libraries are really just used for organization. There's no kind of insight to be found really in the libraries. So I strongly recommend creating one tab for the libraries, or maybe a few tabs, and housing all of the libraries in those tabs or in that tab. Don't kind of mix up libraries and analytics and track topics, because typically if you're going to look at an analysis, the library isn't going to be something that's relevant to look at the same time. It's definitely better to organize the content by your workflow rather than by the subject matter. So you might have an analysis about a particular topic and a library about a topic. It doesn't make sense to put those together because it's unlikely that you're going to want to look at them at the same time. So just have this dedicated libraries tab so you can keep things orderly and organized. So thanks for listening. The next module will be on track topics, where we actually start to use some of this data that is being published into these libraries and allow us to be able to monitor it.